Okay. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome Fons at GESIS and to give this talk. And we have been working the last couple of days. It was very nice, very pleasant to work with you. I have the pleasure to introduce you, and I mean, this is a short bio because I can't possibly remember all the facts, what you've been accomplished, so I will read it to you. I hope that's fine. So Fons Vijver studied psychology at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. He holds a PhD from the same university. He holds a chair in cross-cultural psychology at Tilburg University, the Netherlands, and an extraordinary chair at Northwest University, South Africa, and the University of Queensland, Australia. He has authored and co-authored 450 publications, mainly in the domain of cross-cultural psychology. The main topics in his research involve bias and equivalence, psychological acculturation and multiculturalism, cognitive similarities and differences, response styles, translations, and adaptations. He has been supervising 35 PhD studies and 10 postdoc studies. He has teaching experience in cross-cultural psychology and methods and statistics. He has presented keynotes and invited lecture at various conferences and workshops in various countries. He's one of the most frequently cited cross-cultural psychologists in Europe. Yeah. You're famous. He is the former editor of the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology. It's the flagship journal of cross-cultural psychology and serves on the board of various journals. He has evaluated manuscripts for about 125 journals as an ad hoc reviewer. I think I have 15. He has been Vice Dean for Research and Vice Dean for Education of his faculty and Vice Director of Babylon, the Interdisciplinary Research Center for Studies of Multicultural Societies at Tilburg University. He is a former president of Division 2, Assessment and Evaluation, of the International Association of Applied Psychology, the European Association of Psychological Assessment, and president of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology. He is a 2013 recipient of the International Award of the American Psychological Association for his contribution to international cooperation and to the advancement of knowledge of psychology. And a 2014 recipient of the IAAP Fellow Awards of the International Association of Applied Psychology for contributions to applied psychology. And, doesn't end, and 2014 Sindbad Award of the Dutch Psychological Association for his contributions to intercultural psychology. We are very happy to have you here, and we're very curious what you have to tell us.
Okay.
Thank
you very much, Katja. Thanks for the opportunity to share thoughts and the wonderful reception here in Mannheim and the work we've done together and the introduction now. What I would like to do is say something what we've done in the last period about response styles across cultures. I'm interested in cross-cultural research. My background is psychological, whereas most of you have a survey background. There's considerable overlap between the two disciplines, but there are also considerable differences between the two disciplines. I will present mainly work that is survey-based and 2 large empirical studies, survey-based, and the last one is a classical psychological study with convenient sample of psychology students from many different countries in which we compare different sets of response styles. Okay, much of this work has done together with Jia He. Jia He was a former PhD student. She was the 2016 recipient of the ICCP Best Dissertation Award. She got this award in China, and she's one of these very bright Chinese scholars who in many ways complies with all the Chinese prejudices about hardworking and being smart. So she goes in Western countries by the name of genius. My argument will be that response styles have been frequently studied, but poorly understood. My date of birth is 1950. No, my year of birth is 1952. That was more or less the start in psychology for systematically studying response style differences. Lee Cronbach was the first one to identify this in psychology. But we have been doing this for essentially 65 years, and we still don't have a clue what they mean. So somewhere we have taken the wrong turn along the road, I guess. One of the major issues, notably in cross-cultural psychology, is the distinction between where the response styles are nuisance factors that should be eliminated, that they should be abandoned, that you should try to model away, of experimentalize away, or whatever, or whether response styles are communication filters, which are used by people to communicate. I will come back to this distinction at the end, and I will argue that in fact we have much more evidence for communication styles than for anything else. You cannot wash them away, you don't need to wash them away, it's counterproductive to wash them away. And I will, in the last study, compare different procedures to address response styles. The two first studies I will present have been published, the last one is really very fresh. We completed the analysis a few weeks ago. Okay. I start with what's very common. My background is not GESIS. My background in international large-scale surveys are mainly OECD-initiated studies. I'm involved in PISA. I'm involved in PIAC, well known here. I'm involved in TALIS, Teaching and Learning International Survey. And I'm involved in the 3S survey, probably not known here, Starting Strong survey. It's a kind of a TALIS for early childhood education. In PISA, there's a classical problem that we always encounter, and that's more or less the following. In PISA, we ask for the so-called background questionnaire for motivation and interest in scientific topics. Are you interested in science? Are you interested in reading? Are you interested in mathematics? Those measures correlate within each country positively with achievement, as you would expect. People who report more motivation achieve better. However, if you aggregate the data, so we're talking about multi-level structure here, if you aggregate the data at country level, so you no longer have 400,000 students, but you have 65 countries with an achievement score and a motivation score, all of a sudden you find a strong negative correlation, usually around -0.60. So we're talking business here. We're talking very strong correlation. So what you see is that by aggregating the data from individual level to country level, the correlation reverses and becomes much, much stronger. So now the question is, what's going on here? And my argument is that these response styles could play a very important role. Why? In East Asia, you score very high. East Asian countries score very high. Taiwan, Shanghai, Japan, South Korea score sky high on achievement. And if you ask those students, are you motivated, are you interested in science, they will not tell you very much so. If you say that you're very much interested in science, you're bragging about yourself. There's a modesty more in that part of the world, which tells you you should not brag about yourself. Yeah? As a consequence, they go for the middle of the scale. If you go to Central South America, if you go to Mexico, I don't know whether you've ever been to Mexico, but if you ask a Mexican adolescent, are you interested in science? Yes. But they come up with low scores. Yeah, education is not very good, and comparatively speaking, in Mexico. So in Latin American countries, you score higher motivation with low on achievement. So those are the anchors for your strong negative correlation. My argument is that this is mainly a way in which people communicate with the world, yeah, in which they display themselves. This is not an artifact. This is very real. It is replicable. You can replicate it from one wave to the other. We have studied that. Yeah, so it's a very stable phenomenon. Still, how do you deal with it? Okay, what are the most frequently studied response styles? I will come back to the motivation achievement paradox at the end. We usually talk about SDR, social desirability responding, usually measured by scales like the Marlowe Crown or something like that. Extremity response style, usually operationalized as the proportion of extreme responses, strongly agree or strongly disagree. Acquiescence response style is the proportion of agree responses, and midpoint responding style, proportion of answers in the mid category. Straightforward, we did not invent this. This is common, how this is operationalized, at least in the psychological literature. What are the problems? There are many definitions and measures. The field is fragmented. There are no unifying theories. It's amazing if you look at theories of social desirability. Social desirability is unifactorial, it's two-factorial, it's four-factorial, it has a hierarchical structure. Everything is there in the literature. There's just no, it's not a unifying field at all. The measures do not function well from a cross-cultural perspective. There are invariance issues with the common measures, so there's a serious problem. There are systematic cross-cultural differences in response styles, but we do not know how to interpret these. What you typically see is that response styles are smaller in more affluent countries, and they are larger in more affluent countries. Larger and less affluent countries. That's the broad pattern. So we clearly need to go back to the drawing board. It's a bit of a sobering conclusion after 60 years of research, but that I think this is where we are. We did not advance very much. Okay. Proposed solutions, you can talk about, that's what I will explore here in this presentation, to integrate various styles, and you can focus on the interpretation of the meaning of the styles. So there are two views on response styles. It can be a nuisance. You have to hide reality. It hides reality, and you have to, it's under a blanket, you have to remove the blanket. That's the idea. The most common way of looking at this is in the Einstein personality questionnaire. The idea there is if you score above a certain threshold on that questionnaire, the other responses on the personality scales will not be used. You're supposed to be a liar, so your data cannot be used. That's the argument. Yeah. Now, to some extent, there is an aspect, a grain of truth in this argument. If you ask me whether I have been using cocaine in the last week, and I tell you no, you can take a hair sample and check whether it's true what I'm saying. In that case, it's social desirability. In other cases, it's not all that clear whether it's really about lying. Therefore, notably in cross-cultural psychology, it has become popular to see response styles as ways of communication with the world. A response style, if I have an extreme opinion, it is how I want to be seen by other people in the world. I communicate with the world. And my response style is a negotiation style. Yeah, it's all about communication. That's the alternative view. Let's take a look how we can integrate this. For some reason, which I do not understand, different researchers seem to have their preferred response style. Some people always work with social desirability. Many people work with acquiescence. Fewer people work with extremity. And very, very few people look at the combination of these things. But if you look at it from a conceptual point of view, it is reasonable to assume that midpoint and extremity responses will be negatively correlated. If you go for the extremes, you don't go for the midpoints, and the other way around. So you could assume that there's a negative correlation there. Acquiescence and extremity negatively correlated. If you go for agree, you don't go for extremely agree or disagree. Social desirability and extremity can also be expected to be positively correlated. So, in sum, I would expect one latent factor. If you have all the response styles together, you would end up with one latent factor with social desirability and extremity at one end, and acquiescence and midpoint responding on the other end. If this is true, my latent factor would work like a volume button, which I can turn up and turn down. If I turn it up, I go for social desirability and extremity. If I turn it down, I go for acquiescence and midpoint responding. That is the expectation. We conducted a study measuring personality and all these different styles. And I need a small detour here. In personality, there is increased interest in the so-called big one. The big five is very popular in personality. So you have openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or emotional stability. If you extract one factor, you get a big one. And there's a lot of discussion about the meaning of the big one. It has been used by evolutionary psychologists to make an argument, has been used by many people. My argument is, if you aggregate everything that goes together in personality, that is what you get. If you extract the big one, everything that goes together, you end up with a communication style. It is how we relate to other people. So I would expect that this big one would be correlated with a response style. We studied this in a mainstream and immigrant group of Western, non-Western, first generation, Western, non-Western immigrants in the Netherlands. The research question, what is the association between the big one, so the one big factor of personality, and the general response style? And the general response style is then the style that brings together acquiescence, extremity, midpoint responding, and social desirability. So what is common in the response styles is called the general response style. What's common in personality is called the big one. Okay. Are there cross-cultural differences in means and associations of the general response style? Okay. Those are our samples, this is a probability sample of mainstreamers and immigrants in the Netherlands. Yeah? These are the numbers, educational level on a 6-point scale, I think. Yeah, 6-point scale. What you see is that the second generation Western immigrants are typically more highly educated. These, I think, you would find the same in Germany. These are the professionals coming from other countries to fill very specific, usually highly skilled jobs in the Netherlands. So there are many people from Germany, many people from Belgium, working in the Netherlands, usually at highly skilled jobs. Okay, 2 measures of response style, direct and indirect. I will come to that in a minute. And personality, the big 5, using the public pool, the shared pool, the IP items. We have direct measures of response styles. So we were asking people, unlike what's usually done in the literature, are you of the extreme type? Do you find it important to have extreme opinions? Are you of the agreeing type? Do you like to extract nuanced opinions? Yeah. So we had a direct measure of response style of all these. Yeah. For instance, do you prefer strong opinions to no at all? We also had indirect measures, and that is what you usually have. You take a large set of items, preferably from many different domains, and you look for the proportion of agree responses, of strongly agree responses, etc. That gives you an indicator of the extremity of the response style. Please note that this amounts to a recoding of responses, dichotomizing coding, right? Every response becomes either a 0 or a 1. If you look at the internal consistency of those matrices, it's remarkable how high these values are. We have alphas often of 0.70 and above. So people really have a strong personal style of responding. Yeah, it's really it's kind of the DNA what you see in the response style. We did the same for midpoint responding. We had an extreme response style. Social desirability, 17 items from the Marlowe Crown, 7-point scale, 2-factor solution, impression management, self-perception. Items from the IP pool, measures of the big 5, so all 5 factors were included, and we derived a 1-factor solution. What do we have here for the general response style factor? We have a general response style with, these are the loadings. The positive and negative loadings are in line with what I would have predicted earlier, yeah, with extremity and social desirability in one direction and acquiescence and midpoint in the other direction. And then we have here a method factor, and the method factor models whether it is a direct assessment or an indirect assessment. So these loadings were the same in the non-standardized solutions as were these. Yeah? All straightforward, and the fit was relatively good. Now, if you include also personality, so you have a general response style, you have the big one. Here we have our indicators for the general response style. Here we have our indicators of the big 5. You obviously get a complicated pattern. I do not have enough time, but if you look at the specific, for instance, arrows going from this to this, so from the GRS indicators to the big 1 indicators, they make sense. What is obviously a very important one is the link between general response style and big 1. We predict here the big 1 on the basis of general response style. Obviously, you could argue that it's the other way around, and you should model it as a covariance, blah, blah, all kinds of things possible. Doesn't really matter. What's important is that this has a standardized loading of 0.85. Sky high. Yeah? So that again, my argument then is that this one and this one seem to measure by and large the same. So if you aggregate personality at a high level, if you aggregate response styles at a high level, you end up with a similar process. Yeah, it's how we tend to express ourselves. Interestingly, there are also some differences in the latent means, in the sense that, and we find that more often, that non-Western immigrants always have higher scores. They're scored in such a way here that minus means more response style. Yeah, they score higher on the response style, and that's what we always find. Second, immigration people usually, the non-Western immigrants usually score higher on response styles than the Western immigrants and the mainstreamers. What you typically see is that the groups that are more powerful in society show smaller response styles. Yeah, they can be more honest, more open in their response. That's also what we find here. So non-Western immigrants score higher on the general response style. Traits, personality traits with the general response style, by and large, all the same. Yeah, neuroticism minus 35. If you call it emotional stability, you get plus 35. On the observed level, 0.52. On the latent level, as I mentioned, it's 0.85. So it's considerable. Conclusion: strong relationships between general response style, big one. The correlation of personality traits and the general response style are rather uniform. It seems that we have some evidence for calling the general response style a communication style. Well, that was the first study. Let's take a look at the second study. The second study is based on the Teaching and Learning International Survey. Yeah, the TALIS, an OECD-related initiated study. Participants are teachers of students at lower secondary level, ISCAT 2. They also have ISCAT 1 and 3, but we skipped those from the data set because the samples are much smaller. The questionnaire assesses various domains: satisfaction, efficacy, experience, continuous education, professional development, you name it, everything is there. We also applied the social desirability measure. We had a lot of difficulties, by the way, in getting countries accepting the social desirability measure. Some countries found it unethical to ask questions like, I always listen to my pupils or to my students, yeah? Not using it as an indicator of whether people actually listen, but as an indicator of social desirability. Notably, the Nordic countries found that offensive. Yeah? It was, they had a hard time convincing them. Questions: is there a general response style? And obviously, the question then is, what is the impact of the general response style on the cross-country differences? If you correct for the general response style, what's going to happen with my cross-cultural differences? Will they become smaller? Will they become larger? Etc. That is a very relevant question. We had probability samples from a number of countries listed here, at the total sample size over 75,000 students. So for in this community here, this is relatively common. I appreciate that. For psychologists, this is kind of heavy. This probability sample, it's large in each country. You can do a lot with this type of data. So we developed a social desirability scale derived from Marlowe-Crown. We simplified the language and applied it to a teaching context. Yeah, straightforward, simple test adaptation. These are the 10 items. For instance, always listen carefully to students. I'm confident about my judgment about students, etc. 2 different factors supposedly present: positive impression management and negative impression management. And that's exactly what we find. Yeah, we find a positive impression management factor, a negative impression management factor. These two show a pretty strong correlation. There is one item here which challenged the invariance, which we had to release, and one item here, which we had to release, which apparently did not work the same way. Probably this one related to the translation of the word irritated. Irritated has a stronger negative connotation in some languages than in other languages. We didn't realize that when we started the study. Okay, the fit is relatively good. It's not spectacular, but going from configural to metric, it looks fine. Sort of, yeah, not entirely, but sort of. If you go to scalar, it really plummets. Yeah, so there's no evidence whatsoever for scalar invariance. If you do it for the partial, so if you check out the 2 items that do not work, it becomes better, and then you definitely have metric invariance, but again, it plummets when you go to scalar invariance. This is what we always find in these OECD studies. Yeah, if you use CFA in these large-scale studies, you never find scale invariance. Okay, these are the country means. It may not be immediately obvious, but the ranking is more or less in line with what you would expect. Countries with extreme scores are, for instance, here, Abu Dhabi, the Mexican world, sorry, the Arab world. The Arab world likes extreme responses. You're a real man, a real woman if you have a strong opinion. The same for Mexico, Portugal, Serbia, Brazil, etc. And that goes for the other, for the negative impression, they score lowest on negative and highest on positive impression management. So by and large, it makes sense what you find here. Interestingly, there are systematic cross-cultural differences. The scores on positive and negative impression management and the general response style, which you could extract from all the different skills, are correlated with human development to some extent, PISA reading mean, PISA mathematics, and PISA science. So this is country level correlation, right? Because the data that we have are derived from teachers, whereas these PISA scores are derived from students from the same country. So we aggregate at country level. Still, we find this substantial correlations. So these are clearly stable country characteristics. Now, the litmus test, in many cases, is the validity of this stuff. What happens if I compute the size of the cross-cultural differences before and after correction for the general response style? How do we do this? We conducted a maneuver, and we looked at the effect size of country. Straightforward. Yeah? Eta square value, the parcel eta square of country in a maneuver. These are values which you get. So they range from 0.04 to somewhere 0.30. Yeah? Well, this is also significant, but it's not important for us here, whether or not significant. Very interesting question. What happens if you use the general response style as a covariate? What will happen with the effect sizes? Well, what happens with the effect sizes, you find here essentially nothing. Correcting for the general response style does not have any impact on the size of the cross-cultural differences. We have computed it 5 times to make sure that we didn't make a mistake. And James has done it, and I have done it independently of one another. We came to the same conclusion. It really doesn't matter. Now, one of the issues there, it's important to realize what's happening here. That is that at the individual level, you have the original scores and you have the corrected scores. Corrected scores are regression-based, where you correct for the GRS, for the general response style. At the individual level, these are the correlations which you find. So correcting for differences in general response style has a huge impact, but it leaves all the individual differences essentially intact. It does not impact. And that's true at the individual level, and it's also true at country level. So you're correcting for something that leaves the rank order untouched. Hence, the same effect. Yeah, it does not reduce the effect size. I will come to that. That's obviously a bit something to reflect on. Response styles share important attributes. An integrated approach may advance our knowledge more than the fractionated approach of the past, in which different styles were studied independently. It pays off to study them together. Style meaningfully related to personality and education at individual and HDI-related variables at country level. I present one study. We found this in a number of studies. The general response style is reliably associated with country level characteristics, and the Human Development Index is a very good indicator of that. Countries that score higher on the Human Development Index score lower on the general response style. It's always an inverse relationship. Okay, no influence of correction on size of group differences, so the correction is not needed. General response style is a volume control device influenced by how we communicate in everyday life, not just a response to questions. So my argument is that a response style is not something, it's not a coat that we start to wear as soon as we start filling out questionnaires. It's something which we always do. It's something also which we do in communication with other people, notably with unknown people. The survey is being in touch with an unknown other. Yeah, that's the communication we are talking about. So we are talking about how do you talk, how to communicate with an unknown other from your own cultural group. That's a typical survey context in which we work. Yeah, and then you get the same idea that of the communication style. It's the persona, the mask that we use in communicating about ourselves. The style is part and parcel of who we are. It's not related to lying, but to how we manage relationships with ourselves and with people around us. That's the argument. Which is not a very popular argument in psychology, by the way. This is swimming against the tide. Okay. The last study, involving many different people, just completed data analysis, so this is all very fresh, there's no paper yet. What we did was, we made a cross-cultural comparison of common correction procedures. In the literature, many different procedures have been proposed to deal with response styles. And the argument has always been, if you do this, you get rid of response styles. On the basis of what we presented before, I think it should make you a bit reluctant to accept that conclusion, but anyway, that's the argument. So, what we did, what did we do? We were interested in the differential impact of common correction procedures. We were using anchoring vignettes, well known here, yeah? Okay, I will briefly explain. GRS, general response style. Ipsatization. Ipsatization is very popular in some areas of psychology. It means that you do not look at the responses people give, but that you deduct the average score of all the responses on a scale. For instance, in value studies, it's very common. You measure all the values and then deduct the global mean of a person from each and every response, so that each person gets a mean score of 0. And the argument is that if you find differences in mean scores on value instruments, those can only reflect response styles. The argument is that one person cannot have more values than another. Persons can have different values. That's the argument. It's also used in personality. And then parceling. Parceling is a trick that has been invented in structured equation modeling to deal with poor model fit. You take items together, subset of items together, so you're no longer interested in the fit of specific items, but you're interested in groups of items. Those have also been proposed as a way to deal with response style effects. We're interested in the cross-cultural comparison, and we are interested in something else, namely the cross-cultural comparability of anchoring vignettes. If you look at the literature, I may not know all the literature, but I'm not aware of any paper in which the equivalence of anchoring vignettes was studied. The comparability of anchoring vignettes is always taken for granted. Yeah, so we were interested about, but how does that work? Why would an anchoring vignette be adequate in cross-cultural comparison? So we had two types of approaches. We had what we call design approaches, where you deal with response styles by influencing the design of the instrument, using anchoring vignettes or assessment of response styles in the way that we did before. Are you of the acquiescent type? Yeah. And we had analysis approaches, ipsatization, parceling, and we used two different ways of modeling, categorical modeling and continuous modeling, yeah, to deal with response styles. We used anchoring vignettes, 8 sets. The vignettes targeted the different response styles and also personality, a positively and a negatively related trait, and 2 value types. So we did not use one anchoring vignette and then correct all scores. We had domain-specific anchoring vignettes. This is an example of an anchoring vignette. Reconstruction for each person below and rate how much a statement being very successful is important to him. He hopes people will recognize his achievement resembles him. Vignette 1, the high trait condition. Already since childhood, Bruno has wanted to achieve a lot in his life and he has worked a lot for it. Despite extreme poverty at home, he managed to get good education. Long hours at work have made him a very valued specialist and he has received ever better job offers. Vignette 2, the low trait condition. Brad used to work as a salesman at a shop But recently, he asked to be a cleaner because this would require less effort and shorter working hours. Although he lost a significant share of his salary, he's happy to have more free time to sit in front of the TV at home. So this is about conscientiousness, high and low. The idea is that people rate conscientiousness of this person, conscientiousness of this person, and then conscientiousness of themselves. And then the self-score, the self-reported score, is rescaled as a function of the scores given here. Standard way of dealing with anchoring vignettes. 5 response anchors with vary from item to item. Self-report measures were used in the same way as described before. We had 10 questions per skill with both positively and negatively phrased items. We used a simplified version of the Marlowe Crown social desirability scale. All relatively straightforward. Personality, we had 5 personality scales: agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, openness, and emotional stability. 50 items from the IPIP pool, with options ranging from 1 to 5 very inaccurate to very accurate. And we had values. We used the Schwarz's instrument, the portrait values questionnaire measuring self-enhancement, self-transcendence, openness to change, and conservation. Again, relatively straightforward. These are the sample characteristics. Note that we have student samples here. Yeah, we have convenience samples here. So there's no claim that this generalizes to the countries at large. So you can see that this is typical. The early adolescents and the early adults, and we have some seriously skewed distributions in terms of gender. We were first interested in the invariance of the anchoring vignettes. This is for the low trait ratings. For the high trait ratings, what you can see is configural metric look fine. However, if you go to scalar invariance, it drops dramatically in both conditions. We have looked at the invariance of all the anchoring vignettes, and this is the pattern we always see. We never find any evidence for scalar invariance of the anchoring vignettes. Now, conclusion, equivalence of anchoring vignettes should be tested, because even the metric equivalence was not always supported in our data set. So comparability of anchoring vignettes is a very big issue, notably if you have large-scale surveys involving many different countries. These are the Cronbach alphas for the different scales. So we have the raw scales, using anchored scores, using GRS corrected scores, using the ipsatized, so working with the deviant scores, and using with parcel. What you see is that globally, the Cronbach's alpha of most instruments seem to work well, notably the anchored are pretty high, and the ipsatized are pretty low. I will come back to with negative results about the ipsatized scores later on. We do not find any evidence that ipsatization really does something valuable to your data. It's interesting here, this high number for the anchored scores. At first I thought this looks nice. On second thought, I thought this may be a mathematical artifact. If you use correction scores, for instance for personality, you correct all the personality items using the same filter scores. Yeah? So everything is rescaled for a person in a systematic manner. And I think what you see is that using the same correction for all items enhances the consistency of scores. Yeah? So I think that by using anchoring vignettes, you boost your internal consistency for the wrong reasons. You add consistency to people which they didn't show in their actual behavior. Okay. This CFI values, this is obviously very busy, but here it's summarized. So what you see is that the raw, continuous and categorical, these are the CFI values. What you see is that the anchored are more or less comparable. GRS continuous not too far off. Ipsatized is really very bad. Yeah? And parcel works a bit better. Categorical better than continuous. Scalar invariance not supported. Ipsatized scoring really challenged comparability, and the anchoring vignettes seem to perform better, however, it may be for the wrong reasons. Okay. These are the correlations of the factor scores and the different conditions as an example for agreement, but quite comparable with the rest. What you see is that there's a cluster of raw scores and GRS corrected scores, and a second, what you also see is a positive correlations prevail, but often not very strong. For instance, if you look at ipsatized, the correlations are not spectacular. For some of the parcels, the correlations are not exactly spectacular. Yeah? So they're pretty low, pretty weak. It really depends which procedure you're using. That is quite clear. Correlations between openness and openness to change. What you see there is that the correlations are more or less the same for the raw categories. Anchoring, it goes down a bit. GRS is the same as this one. Ipsatized again drops. The parcels seem to work better, but not the anchored parcels. So the pattern is relatively consistent. What are the applications? Anchoring vignettes could have a small positive influence, but it may be for the wrong reasons. Ipsatization really doesn't work consistently, yes, although it's very frequently used. GRS is very close to the raw scores. In line with what I've reported before, GRS may be a big deal, but it does not correct. That is more or less the bottom line. And parceling does not have a major impact on invariance. Now, you also have to realize that parceling has been criticized, at least in the psychological literature, because it's arbitrary. There is no unique way of parceling. Okay. Let's take a look at some conclusions. We still need validity evidence for the response styles. Some procedures have obvious disadvantages in large-scale assessment. Anchoring vignettes are notorious for increasing the reading load. And if you, even in PISA, this is already a problem, we think that 15-year-olds can read and write. Well, you will be astonished to see that in some countries. So that may be a problem. The field of view on separability of substance and style and response styles may be counterproductive. It's almost like getting sunshine out of a tomato. I mean, there's a lot of sunshine in a tomato, but you would be unable to get it out. It's something similar here. Yeah. We cannot filter it out. We cannot filter it away. So it may be more productive to abandon the view on the undesirability of response styles, and it may be better to see it as an inevitability. Now, let's take a look where we started, the motivation and achievement paradox. I think if we look, how can we explain the reversal of the correlations, right? From small positive correlations at the individual level to strong negative correlations. Now, people from ETS have worked with anchoring vignettes, and to some extent, anchoring vignettes were able to remedy the problem. However, in the late study, it was replicated, and they could not replicate the findings. So it's a bit shaky. What I think where we should start is that if we measure something like motivation, don't call it motivation. It is self-reported motivation. The fact that we measure self-reported motivation means that we measure something that is always moderated by cultural norms. You cannot turn off these cultural norms. They're part and parcel of how we function. Yeah? That is how we were brought up. There's nothing wrong with that. Quite the opposite. It's who we are. It's how we express ourselves. So it's important to realize that when we are after all these self-reported things, we always go for cultural moderation. This is true in individualistic cultures. This is true in collectivistic cultures. More in collectivistic than individualistic. Still, it's true in all cultures. So what may be a better way of looking at this? That is that we don't go for the self-reported motivation or call it something else, but that we go for different measures. If you're interested in mathematics, if you're interested in the question whether a student is interested in mathematics, don't ask whether he's interested in mathematics, but then you run into all these problems. Ask how many things he has done in the last 2 weeks that were related to mathematics. How many books did you read that dealt with mathematics? How often did you talk with your friends about mathematics? Even there you may have social desirability issues, but there may be less. So I think the closer you get to actual behavior, the less susceptible you are to these influences. And there you may find a very different pattern of relations. I would expect that Korean children talk more with their peers about mathematics than Mexican adolescents would do. Yeah, which would be in line with what I would expect. So the bottom line, where does this leave us? We still have a lot that we do not know about response styles, but I think it would start if we would conceptualize these styles in a different manner and try to deal with it in a very different manner. Not trying to separate them. They're not separable. You can't get out, you cannot get the sunshine out of the tomato. However, if you can't beat them, join them, look for other ways to assess things you're interested in. Yeah? And if you correlate achievement with self-reports, achievement is not moderated by cultural norms. Self-reports are. Then you have a problem. Yeah? So start to think that beforehand how this is going to affect your measurement. So I think if we would proceed this way, we may enrich our understanding of cross-cultural differences. It means that we need to go to different measures, yeah? And that we would need to stop these simple self-report measures of a number of constructs. For other constructs, you can only use self-report measures. I mean, I'm not a crusader against self-report measures, quite the opposite, but adapted to the purposes that you have in mind. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Questions or comments? Sir? Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and inspiring talk. I'm Jos Rossmann. I'm a postdoctoral researcher from GESIS, and I personally wrote my doctoral thesis about satisfying response behavior, which is pretty much related to your research, I think. I came across all these studies from, on one hand, from psychological research, which essentially do research on response styles. And on the other hand, studies and research from survey methodology, which is mostly on satisfying response behavior. So I think both traditions are, could be combined, but there are some notable differences. So in psychological research, it seems to me most researchers think that response styles are pretty stable, like trait-like personal characteristics, whereas satisfying theory assumes that this kind of response styles are also influenced by respondent motivation, by ability, by the difficulty of the task. So satisfying theory doesn't deny that it's influenced by personality, but it also depends on task difficulty, motivation, and so on. So they would not assume perfect stability over time, for instance. Within respondent stability over time. So what do you personally think about this debate? Do you think it's more like a trait-like stable characteristic? Or
it's a very interesting question, obviously a very relevant one. What you did not mention is that there may be even item-specific aspects that play a role in satisfying behavior. Absolutely. So the we have been studying, I did not have much time here to deal with it, but we have been studying the consistency of response styles across different instruments. And what you see is that people are remarkably stable in their response styles. So that's clearly in line with a trait view. However, we do not find evidence that the response style is always equally strong. For instance, what we find is that if you have questionnaires dealing with, let me see, I had an the one with the eta square values of the cross-cultural differences. Where is she? Here we are. What you see here, these are effect sizes. So what you see is that, for instance, in something like participation among stakeholders, the eta squared value is very low. Here, professional collaboration, it is very high. So the cross-national differences, but also the individual differences, are much larger in some domains than in other domains. What we find is that, on average, if you look at these domains, the domains in which people are personally involved, show larger eta square values. Yeah? So there are more response styles that things matter to you. Yeah? So you're more inclined to go for an extreme response if things are important for you. So it's moderated by culture, it's moderated by specific content, it's moderated by personality characteristics. You have persons who are more extroverted, who tend to be more outgoing, tend to be more extreme. So it is a personality characteristic. It is a very complex combination of many different factors, each of which can contribute, and there may also be interaction effects between these factors. What we find is that the GRS is very stable, but it does not mean that it's the same always. Yeah, it differs across domains, differs across persons. It has there's a lot of variation. I was mainly interested here in cross-national differences, but that's my background. But the cross-national differences are typically the smaller part of the variation. The individual differences, obviously there's a random error not considered here, but the individual differences are always larger. So personality is a stronger predictor of what goes on than the domain differences we're talking about here, or the country differences we're talking about here. But it's a very interesting question, and what's definitely not the case is that there's a very good coordination or integration of this literature, right? The whole idea of satisficing and say the cognitive modeling of satisficing that has been used in survey research is almost unknown in psychology. Yeah, and I think we can learn a lot from each other. That's for sure. Yeah.
Many thanks for your presentation. So, in your presentation, cross-cultural basically means cross-national.
Yeah.
And so I'm working together with Jason Renfro on
IQ differences?
No, regional personality differences.
Oh, okay.
So differences not between nations, but rather within nations. We find evidence that nations are not like a homogeneous psychological entity, but there exist meaningful differences. So I want to ask whether there's any research on regional differences in response style, and if not, whether you would actually expect to find differences for larger countries like the US, or maybe even smaller ones like Germany.
Yeah, you would expect definitely regional differences, but one of the confounding differences will be that regions are never the same across countries, and that, for instance, if you go to rural Germany and urban Germany, so not even regional, but within one state, go to the urban and to the rural. There you have a confounding of education with place of residence, with ethnicity and place of residence. So there are many confounding factors which come into play. So then the question is whether you are looking at regional differences or whether you're looking at confounding differences. Yeah, which is not the same as saying that this research has no value, obviously, but there are many confounding issues, and that makes it different to look at specific regional variation. If you have, for instance, regions with very high migration rates, you would expect that there are then smaller differences in these personality factors, because the region has had less time to sink in. Yeah. So again, this is a potentially confounding differences, And sure, I would expect the regional differences. There's nothing holy about national borders which were invented a few hundred years ago. Definitely not. And there's nothing holy about language boundaries. Of course not. However, language boundaries tend to be relatively important because people sharing a language often share a way of expressing themselves one way or another. But there can still, obviously, there can be regional differences. And in some countries with not much migration, internal migration, you may find it to be relatively stable. Some of the countries are very big. For instance, if you go to Turkey, that is a very huge country. And what you may find there is that in the European part and in the Kurdic part on the other side, there may be you may find salient differences, and these differences have been there for a very long period of time. So there, I would not expect so much confounding, but in other parts, there would definitely be confounding. For instance, if I look at the Netherlands, there are parts of the Netherlands where it's almost impossible to find a native person. There have been so many movements. So that I think will complicate these matters, but the things that I have been discussing here are obviously also relevant for regional differences or within country differences. Within countries, we're mainly dealing with ethnic differences, but you could also look at other differences, obviously. Yeah, but if you look at regional differences, I would expect that the differences are often not very large, so it may be more difficult to find salient differences. For instance, we did not find differences in the Netherlands between native Dutch people and Western immigrants. If we correct for education, there's no difference anymore. So something similar may be true for regional differences. But if you go to exotic parts of the country where there's hardly any movement, you may find more differences.
I have a more technical question, which refers to how in these models you separated in these indirect measures of acquiescence and extreme responding. Indirect measures of response, how you separated extreme responding from acquiescence.
If you have a 5-point scale, extremity goes to 1 and 5, acquiescence goes to 4, midpoint goes to 3.
So you skip the 5 for acquiescence.
Yes. Yeah. As a consequence, we get an inverse relationship between acquiescence and extremity. Yeah, and also we use different items for each of the 3 scales, for each of the 3 indices, which is technically often it's a very practical problem because not all questionnaires are sufficiently long to have completely non-overlapping items to derive your operationalizations. Yeah.
Were there positively and negatively worded items?
In principle, they were. However, we have also
not balanced, so the same number.
What we find is that it doesn't really matter. In the beginning, we were very strict when we started this. We should have balanced field and we should have positive items and negative items. In practice, it doesn't make all that much of a difference. So we have learned that it's not all that important that you can make all these subtle distinctions. The only thing that is still relevant for what we do is we do not use overlapping items. So we use separate sets of items for all our indices. But apart from that, it doesn't really matter. We have even worked with frequency scales. Use a 7-point frequency scale, 4 goes to midpoint, 7 goes to extremity. We don't have agree on this there, we find the same. Yeah.
Another technical question, if I may. How did you get CFAs or EFAs, whatever it were, in the last study to run on ipsatized scores? Because technically I thought that has to result in a non-positive matrix because you have with k with k minus 1
right.
points.
Minus 1 over k minus 1 is the average intercorrelation, right?
Yeah.
We did not run into those problems in this specific case. James did the analysis, so I'm not familiar with all the details. But what you typically get is that you do not get a degenerated solution. we still could use the scores. It may be due to the fact that if you work with scores, you never work with a sufficient number of decimals, so it gives you a bit of an artifact of the way in which it was computed. And if you look at the average intercorrelation, they go in that direction. And but we did not run into those issues. Yeah. Now, what you also sometimes see is that in the analysis, more items are included than just the ipsatized items. And then, obviously,
this must be why.
Yeah, then you don't have that problem anymore.
Sort of borrow information from
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then you don't have that problem anymore. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. I have a question.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Thank you for the interesting talk. You have data for very young children, I think, and also for young children, for migrants, or migrant background. Is there evidence that there's a socialization effect for young migrant children, that they have a different response style and they learn the native response style when they age?
We have a very indirect evidence for that. Not among children, but among adults.
When they migrate and that they assimilate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So here what we find is that there is a difference between non-Western and Western, but this is among adults. But what you see is that there's also a bit of an acculturation effect. And that when immigrants become more adjusted to the mainstream context, you would expect that they would adopt a more Western type of responding, which means fewer response styles. Yeah.
I come from a sociological background, and the sociologists always keep their ears closed, and we don't have this problem. We only have solid answers.
Right.
Solid answers. No agents, just behavioral questions. But we would have this problem, especially for the whole social mobility research, when I learn my response style to my parents, there would be the question if the whole social mobility is just a mobility of a response style.
Wow, okay. I'm not sure we should go that far. But it's value transmission. That's what we're talking about here, in the generational value transmission. There's a lot of literature which shows that for young children, it's all dependent on the parents, but the older we get, the more peer influence there is, and notably among groups of immigrants. Yeah. So these immigrants, they start talking with each other, they get friends from the mainstream group, which means that in terms of values, they're influenced by other patterns. How should you find your marriage partner? Very interesting example. Traditional Turkish families in the Netherlands like to argue that parents should choose partners for their children. The immigrants in the Netherlands typically argue the opposite. They are exposed to Western values. There is the idea of romantic love and that you should choose your own partner and this and that. Yeah? So that is typically an area where there is a value discrepancy, and these adolescents learn the values from their peers, not from their parents. So they adopt the values they are exposed to in many cases as an adolescent. Now, obviously, there's a lot of individual variation within these groups.
But that would shift the problem in a way. So, do they learn the response style from their peers, or do they?
Yes. Oh, yes. Of course. Of course. That also goes for response style. And if for the response style, it would mean that they are less inclined to show conformity. Scoring high on response style typically means showing conformity. Yeah, you go with your group. There are even people who argue that this is a sign that you emphasize your belonging to a group. If you express extremity, if you express social desirability. If you westernize, you become more individualistic. So you say what you like. The idea of you give your personal opinion. When I mentioned about the difficulties in Norway to get the social desirability scale accepted is exactly about this issue. I'm involved in a new study now, and again about social desirability, and again the Nordic countries make problems. It's a trait-like characteristic. Yeah, they come up with problems again. These are very different people who come up with problems now. And they really dislike the idea that you in a way value dishonesty if you measure something like social desirability. They find that really offensive, unethical, etc., etc. So they find it really problematic. You don't need to convince people from Mexico that it's valuable to do so. They know from first hand. They have serious problems with assessment in their own country because the self-reports don't work. They're sky high on the self-reports. Where if you see, it cannot be that our average students have such a motivation for mathematics. I mean, it flies in the face of everyone who knows anything about how these people behave in the classroom. So there are some issues there in how this is assessed. But I think these response styles are clearly open. They are clearly susceptible to socialization influences, and it's part of the new cultural identity. To express yourself, to emphasize your individual identity, and that means that you will start to score lower on social desirability skills.